Stand in the Sahara Desert at noon in July. Go ahead, picture it fully. The temperature at ground level is hovering around 70 degrees Celsius. That's 158 Fahrenheit, for those of you measuring in the units of a country that also deep fries butter. The sand is not merely hot, it is radiating stored heat upward like a griddle that has been preheating since approximately the beginning of time. The air is so dry that sweat evaporates before you notice you're producing it, which feels efficient until you realize your body is losing water faster than your thirst response can register the deficit. Dehydration in the Sahara can become life-threatening within hours. Not days. Hours. There is no shade. There is no water. There is no visible reason for any soft-bodied, water-dependent primate to be anywhere near this place. Every biological instinct in the human body is screaming the same message with increasing urgency. Leave. Go somewhere wet. Immediately. And yet, right in the middle of this, right on the banks of a river cutting through the largest hot desert on Earth, one of the most sophisticated, most productive, most architecturally ambitious, and most administratively complex civilizations in human history ran continuously for 3,000 years. They built monuments so enormous that they remain among the largest structures ever constructed. They fed populations of several million people. They developed writing, mathematics, medicine, engineering, and bureaucratic systems that influenced every subsequent civilization in the Western world. In the desert, in Africa, in heat that would hospitalize a modern person within an afternoon. How did they actually do it? Not in the vague textbook sense of, they had the Nile. Yes, they had the Nile. So did the crocodiles. The crocodiles did not build the pyramids. The answer is far more layered, far more ingenious, and far more revealing about the depth of ancient Egyptian understanding of their environment than the standard historical account ever bothers to convey. All of it. We are going through all of it. Start with the Nile, because you cannot start anywhere else. But start with it properly. Not as a background geographic feature that the civilization happened to be near, but as the total, absolute, non-negotiable foundation upon which every single aspect of Egyptian survival was constructed. The Nile is the longest river on Earth. It flows north through approximately 6,650 kilometers of progressively drier landscape, collecting water from the Ethiopian highlands and the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, and delivering it, improbably and magnificently, into the heart of the Sahara. Without the Nile, the land that became Egypt is indistinguishable from the surrounding desert, hostile, arid, incapable of supporting dense human populations by any available measure. With the Nile, something extraordinary happens. Every year, with a regularity so precise that the ancient Egyptians built their entire calendar around it, the Nile flooded. The inundation, called Akhet in the Egyptian seasonal calendar, began in June when monsoon rains far to the south in Ethiopia caused the Blue Nile to surge, carrying with it an enormous load of volcanic silt scraped from the Ethiopian highlands. This silty floodwater spread across the Egyptian floodplain, depositing a layer of extraordinarily fertile black soil, called kemet in ancient Egyptian, meaning black land, over the fields before receding back to the riverbanks by October. The ancient Egyptians did not just live beside the Nile, they organized their entire civilization around the rhythm of its flooding. Their calendar had 3 seasons: the flood, the planting, and the harvest. Their agricultural system was timed to the flood's withdrawal. Seeds went in as the water receded, planted in soil so fertile that Egyptian grain yields per unit area were among the highest in the ancient world, exceeding Mediterranean averages by substantial margins. Their tax and administrative systems were calibrated to the flood's height. A high flood meant excellent harvest, meant higher tax revenue, meant greater state capacity for monument building and military campaigning. A low flood meant poor harvest, meant food scarcity, meant potential for social instability. The flood was so central to Egyptian civilization that it was deified. Hapiat, the god of the Nile flood, was among the most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon, depicted as a well-fed figure bearing offerings of food, associated with abundance and the fertility of the land. Praying to Happy was not metaphorical religious observance. It was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of monitoring a weather forecast for a civilization whose entire food security rested on a single annual climate event. Water management beyond the flood itself was one of the great technical achievements of ancient Egyptian civilization, and it is substantially less celebrated than the pyramids, despite being more consequential for actual survival. The Egyptians developed irrigation systems of remarkable sophistication that extended the reach of Nile water far beyond the natural floodplain. Basin irrigation, dividing the floodplain into a series of large earthen basins that could be flooded and drained in sequence, allowed water to be stored after the flood's peak and released progressively to fields as needed. This extended the agricultural growing season and allowed cultivation of land that would otherwise dry out too quickly after the flood's recession. Canals were dug, some of them extending considerable distances from the Nile, to bring water to fields that natural flooding could not reach. The engineering of these canals, requiring accurate assessment of gradient, water volume, and the soil permeability without modern surveying equipment, represents a practical hydraulic engineering tradition developed over centuries of empirical learning. The Egyptians did not have calculus. They had generations of accumulated observational knowledge about how water moved through their landscape, and they applied that knowledge with a precision that sustained agricultural productivity in a desert environment for millennia. The shadoof, a counterweighted lever device for lifting water from the river or canal into irrigation channels, appears in Egyptian art from at least the New Kingdom period, and represents one of the earliest labor-saving technologies in agricultural history. A single person operating a shadoof could lift approximately 2,500 liters of water per day, far more than the same person carrying water manually. The simple mechanical advantage of the counterweighted lever was understood and exploited for irrigation long before the formal science of mechanics existed to explain why it worked. Later, the Archimedes screw, which ancient Egyptian evidence suggests may predate the Greek mathematician whose name it carries, allowed water to be raised from lower to higher elevations with continuous rotary motion, dramatically improving irrigation efficiency in areas where water needed to be lifted significant heights. These technologies were not curiosities or demonstrations of abstract ingenuity. They were survival infrastructure, directly responsible for the agricultural productivity that fed a civilization in a desert. Food production in ancient Egypt was diversified in ways that protected against the failure of any single crop and exploited the varied ecological zones that the Nile created. The floodplain itself supported grain cultivation of extraordinary productivity. Emmer wheat and barley were the staple crops, the caloric foundation of the Egyptian diet, grown in the fertile black soil of the inundation zone and yielding harvests that fed both the immediate agricultural population and the urban centers, the pyramid-building workforces, the military, and the administrative apparatus of the state. Egypt's grain surplus was large enough that it exported food to neighboring regions and used grain as a strategic resource in diplomacy. A soft power tool made possible by the agricultural productivity of the Nile Valley. Beyond grains, the Nile and its margins produced a remarkable diversity of food resources. Fish were abundant. Ancient Egyptian garbage middens contain enormous quantities of fish bones representing numerous Nile species, and fishing was practiced at every scale from subsistence to organized commercial operation. Waterfowl nesting in the papyrus marshes along the river's edges were hunted and trapped in quantities visible in the abundant hunting scenes depicted in Egyptian tomb art. Lotus seeds and roots, papyrus roots, and various aquatic plants supplemented the diet with carbohydrates and nutrients not available from field cultivation. The desert margins, the zone between the cultivated floodplain and the open desert, supported pastoralism. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were maintained in herds that grazed on vegetation in the transitional zone and were fed on agricultural byproducts. Animal products, milk, cheese, meat, leather, wool, supplemented the grain-heavy diet and provided resources for crafts and trade. The integration of pastoral and agricultural production was sophisticated enough that the two systems supported each other. Animal manure, fertilized fields, agricultural waste-fed animals, and the whole system maintained a productivity that simple grain farming alone could not have sustained. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Vegetables and fruits cultivated in garden plots along the riverbanks added nutritional diversity. Onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, cucumbers, melons, figs, dates, pomegranates, and grapes all appear in the archaeological record and in the extensive lists of food offerings documented in Egyptian funerary contexts. The Egyptian diet, at least for urban populations and the more prosperous agricultural communities, was considerably more varied and nutritionally adequate than the image of a grain-dependent desert civilization might suggest. The thermal management strategies of ancient Egyptians are where the ingenuity becomes most immediately impressive to anyone who has spent time in a hot climate and thought carefully about how to stay alive in it. Egyptian architecture is thermal engineering. Every element of traditional Egyptian building design, the thick mud brick walls, the small windows positioned high in walls, the courtyard layouts, the rooftop sleeping areas, reflects a deep, empirical understanding of heat management in a climate where the difference between a well-designed building and a poorly designed one could be the difference between tolerable and lethal. Mud brick is an extraordinarily effective building material in hot, dry climates, and the Egyptians used it for virtually everything except their most monumental state constructions. The thermal mass of thick mud brick walls absorbs heat slowly during the day, preventing interior temperatures from rising with the exterior temperature, and releases that stored heat slowly at night when exterior temperatures drop. The result is a building whose interior temperature lags significantly behind the exterior, cooler than outside during the day's peak heat, warmer than outside during the cold desert night. In a climate with extreme diurnal temperature swings, this thermal buffering is enormously valuable and was achieved with a building material that required no special manufacturing beyond the combination of Nile mud, straw, and sunlight. Window placement was not aesthetic. Small windows positioned near the top of interior walls caught prevailing breezes while minimizing the entry of direct solar radiation. The design principle underlying the modern understanding of passive ventilation and solar shading applied empirically thousands of years before building physics existed as a discipline. Courtyards created microclimates within compound layouts, shaded areas where air movement was channeled through the architectural geometry in ways that produced temperatures several degrees cooler than surrounding open areas. The Malkaf, a wind-catching tower that directed prevailing breezes downward into interior spaces, appears in Egyptian architectural tradition and represents one of the earliest passive cooling technologies ever developed. The principle is the same as the modern wind tower or badgir found across the Middle East and South Asia. Use architectural geometry to capture and direct natural air movement into living spaces, reducing interior temperatures without any energy input beyond the wind itself. Clothing as thermal technology deserves sustained attention because the Egyptian approach to dress was precisely calibrated to the physiological demands of their climate in ways that modern clothing science would recognize as correct. Linen, woven from the fibers of the flax plant, cultivated extensively in the Nile Valley, was the dominant fabric of ancient Egypt across all social classes. The properties of linen that made it the Egyptian textile of choice are the same properties that make it preferred by modern travelers and outdoor enthusiasts in hot climates. It is lightweight, breathes exceptionally well, wicks moisture away from the skin, and dries rapidly after absorbing sweat. Linen's natural luster allows it to reflect a portion of incident, solar radiation rather than absorbing it, reducing the heat load on the wearer compared to darker, denser fabrics. The white or undyed linen that most Egyptians wore maximized solar reflectivity, a choice that was not aesthetic convention but effective solar management. The loose, flowing cuts of Egyptian garments promoted airflow next to the skin, enhancing evaporative cooling in an environment where sweat evaporation is the primary mechanism of human thermoregulation. The Egyptian wardrobe was, in modern terms, optimized for hot, dry climate performance in every design dimension. Head covering in the desert sun was understood as essential long before anyone could explain ultraviolet radiation or heat stroke. The various headdress traditions of Egyptian culture, from the simple linen cloth covering of agricultural workers to the elaborate nemes of royalty, all shared the function of shading the head and neck from direct solar exposure. The head is a critical heat gain surface. The brain is temperature sensitive, and the scalp is relatively poorly insulated. Covering the head in desert sun significantly reduces core temperature rise. And the Egyptians knew this not from physiology textbooks, but from the accumulated experience of a civilization that had been managing desert heat for 3,000 years. The Egyptian understanding of the human body's heat management requirements extended into medical practice with a sophistication that continues to surprise researchers examining the ancient medical texts. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest preserved medical documents in human history, dating to approximately 1550 BCE, contains treatments for conditions that modern physicians recognize as heat exhaustion and heat stroke. The recommended interventions: rest in cool locations, fluid replacement, cooling of the body surface, are consistent with modern emergency management of hyperthermia. The ancient Egyptian physicians did not understand the physiology of heat illness at the cellular level, but they had observed its clinical presentation and developed effective empirical treatments through the same process that produces all pre-theoretical medicine: careful observation of what works. Hydration management was embedded in Egyptian food culture in ways that addressed the climate's demands without necessarily framing the practice as a health intervention. Beer, a fermented grain beverage that was the daily drink of the Egyptian working population, was an effective hydration vehicle that provided calories, B vitamins, and fluid simultaneously. The beer of ancient Egypt was quite different from modern beer: lower in alcohol, thicker in consistency, more nutritionally substantial, and functioned as a food as much as a beverage. Workers on state projects including pyramid construction were issued beer rations as part of their compensation and provisioning, a practice that addressed caloric and fluid needs simultaneously. The consumption of high water content foods, the cucumbers, melons, lettuce, and other vegetables that appear consistently in the Egyptian diet, contributed to fluid intake in ways that supplemented direct water consumption. In a climate where water loss through perspiration is constant and substantial, dietary water content is not merely nutritional detail, it is a meaningful component of fluid balance management. The Egyptian agricultural system that produced these foods was also, in a sense, a hydration management system. Social organization as a survival technology is perhaps the least obvious dimension of this story, but it may be the most important. Surviving in a desert environment at the scale of a civilization requires not just individual ingenuity, but coordinated collective action of extraordinary scope. The irrigation systems that extended Nile water to distant fields required construction and maintenance by organized labor, working across distances and time frames that no individual or family unit could manage. The grain storage systems that buffered the population against flood failures required administrative infrastructure capable of collecting, storing, accounting for, and redistributing food resources across a geographically extended population. The trade networks that supplemented local production with resources not available in the Nile Valley required diplomatic capacity, transport logistics, and institutional continuity across generations. The Egyptian state, with its pharaonic authority, its professional bureaucracy, its temple administrative systems, and its provincial governance structure, was the organizational technology that made all of these coordinated functions possible. The pyramids are often held up as the supreme achievement of Egyptian organizational capacity, and they are genuinely remarkable demonstrations of that capacity. But the grain storage and redistribution system that prevented famines during low flood years, the irrigation maintenance that sustained agricultural productivity across decades, The trade logistics that brought copper from Sinai and cedar from Lebanon and gold from Nubia to where they were needed. These unglamorous administrative achievements are the ones that kept 3 million people alive in a desert. The redistribution system of ancient Egypt, the state's capacity to collect agricultural surplus from productive years and regions and deploy it to deficit years and regions, was effectively a food security insurance system operating at a civilizational scale. The biblical story of Joseph advising Pharaoh to store grain during 7 years of abundance to buffer against 7 years of famine is not necessarily historical in its details, but it accurately captures the administrative reality of how Egyptian state granaries functioned as risk management infrastructure for a population dependent on an annual climate event. Desert knowledge, the accumulated wisdom about how to move through, survive in, and extract resources from the desert environment itself, was a distinct body of expertise that ancient Egyptians maintained and applied in ways that extended their effective range well beyond the Nile floodplain. The oases of the western desert, Siwa, Baharia, Farafra, Dakhla, Karga, were not random waypoints, but integrated nodes in Egyptian administrative and trade networks, connected by routes across desert terrain that Egyptian travelers, soldiers, and traders navigated with expertise developed over generations. The knowledge required to navigate desert routes without modern instruments, reading star positions, identifying wind patterns, recognizing terrain features, locating water sources, timing travel to avoid lethal midday heat, was not casual knowledge. It was technical expertise maintained in communities whose survival depended on it. Desert travel was conducted during cooler hours, dawn, dusk, and night, with rest during the peak heat of midday. This temporal adjustment to desert conditions is the oldest and most effective heat management strategy available to travelers without modern technology, and the Egyptians applied it consistently in contexts ranging from trade expeditions to military campaigns. The logistics of provisioning desert crossings, carrying sufficient water, food, and fodder for animals across distances between reliable water sources, required careful planning based on accurate knowledge of route distances and resource locations that accumulated across generations of travelers. Animals adapted to desert conditions, the donkey most prominently, and later the camel, were integrated into Egyptian transport and logistics in ways that extended the range and carrying capacity of desert operations. The donkey's superior water efficiency compared to horses and its sure-footedness on loose terrain made it the working animal of choice for desert transport across the ancient world. The camel's legendary water management capacity, understood empirically long before anyone explained the physiology of its remarkable metabolic adaptations, transformed long-distance desert travel when it became widely available in the later periods of Egyptian history. The medical dimension of desert survival extended beyond heat management into the management of the diseases that the Nile environment specifically created. The same Nile flood that delivered fertile soil also delivered standing water. And standing water in a hot climate is a mosquito breeding ground of extraordinary productivity. Malaria was endemic in ancient Egypt, and the management of its effects, rather than any prevention of its cause, was a significant component of ancient Egyptian medical practice. Various plant-derived treatments for fever appear in medical papyri, and while their specific mechanisms were not understood, some had genuine pharmacological activity against malarial symptoms. Schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease transmitted through contact with freshwater snails in the Nile, infected a significant portion of the ancient Egyptian population, as revealed by examination of mummified remains. The debilitating effects of chronic schistosomiasis on the workforce represent a persistent health burden that Egyptian medical practice addressed symptomatically without being able to prevent. The disease was so common that some researchers have suggested its chronic effects may have contributed to the generally shorter statures and lower average life expectancies of ancient Egyptian populations compared to some contemporary groups. Eye diseases, particularly trachoma, caused by a bacterial infection that spreads readily in hot, dusty environments with limited access to clean water for washing, were so prevalent in ancient Egypt that elaborate treatments for eye conditions constitute some of the largest sections of the medical papyri. The application of kohl, the dark eye cosmetic universally associated with Egyptian aesthetics, had a practical dimension alongside its aesthetic function. Kohl containing lead compounds has measurable antibacterial properties and may have provided partial protection against eye infections in a population with extremely high exposure risk. The line between cosmetic and medical practice in ancient Egypt was considerably blurrier than modern categorical distinctions suggest. Many substances used for appearance-related purposes also had genuine pharmacological or protective functions, a convergence that makes sense in a civilization where the environment created constant exposure to conditions that threatened both comfort and health. What ties all of this together? The water management, the architecture, the clothing, the food systems, the administrative organization, the desert knowledge, the medical practice, is a theme that runs through every dimension of Egyptian civilization. Deep, accumulated, empirically tested knowledge of a difficult environment, institutionalized and transmitted across generations with the administrative continuity that only a long-lived, stable civilization can provide. Ancient Egyptians survived the desert not by conquering it or ignoring it or simply enduring it, but by understanding it with a precision that 3,000 years of continuous observation and adaptation produces. They knew their river's behavior with enough accuracy to build their entire civilization around its annual rhythm. They knew their climate's demands well enough to develop architecture, clothing, diet, and daily schedules calibrated to its precise requirements. They knew their desert's roots well enough to integrate it into trade and administrative networks, rather than treating it purely as an obstacle. The Sahara did not change to accommodate the Egyptians. The Egyptians changed, institutionally, technologically, culturally, to accommodate the Sahara. And the civilization that emerged from that accommodation was not a diminished version of what civilization could be in a more hospitable environment. It was, by any meaningful measure, one of the most successful and durable civilizations in human history. One that outlasted empires in milder climates, that produced achievements in architecture, medicine, administration, and art that influenced every subsequent civilization in its reach. The desert was not their enemy. The desert was their environment, and they learned it, slowly, carefully, through generations of accumulated observation, with a thoroughness that the word survival does not quite capture. They did not merely survive the desert, they made it home.